Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Seth, psychologist, with Couch Commentary. When I do Couch Commentary, I just talk about something that's going on in the culture from a psychological perspective. And today, I want to just take a few minutes and talk about the new Netflix documentary, The Carman Family Deaths. This is a fascinating documentary, I think, and one that is important psychologically because of its focus on autism. Now, let me just start by saying if I were an individual who had a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, I would have a very strong and negative reaction, I imagine, to this documentary. Why? Because it really felt to me like these two things are equated in this documentary: violence or homicide and murder with autism. So before we go further, let's go back a little bit with who was Nathan Carman. Nathan Carman was a young man in his early 20s, and he was a part of a larger family in New England, a very wealthy family. There was his grandfather, Nathan's grandfather, John Chocolus, and he was a very wealthy man, had made a lot of money apparently in real estate, nursing homes, for example, and had, by some accounts, an estimated worth of over $40 million. Well, when Nathan was in his early 20s, he and his mother went out on a fishing trip, and this was fairly normal for them. The problem, of course, was that his mother never came back. And that is largely the basis of this documentary. The initial disappearance of Nathan's mother. She was just never found again. She was lost at sea. And that boat, which was named the Chicken Pox, sank. And even the life raft that he was found floating in and rescued by the Coast Guard, even that sank and was never found again. But about 6 years after that disappearance, Nathan was finally charged with that murder. The documentary also goes in to explain another unexplained death, the death of the grandfather, John Chocolus. And actually, he was shot to death in his own bed. And actually, who was the last person to see that grandfather that night but Nathan himself? So there was a lot of evidence reviewed in the documentary to suggest that Nathan may have been responsible for that death as well. So that was really the focus of this documentary. What happened? The death of the grandfather, John Chocolus. There was never anyone charged for that. And yet Nathan was charged for the murder of his own mother. And at 29 years old, while Nathan was in jail awaiting trial, he ended his own life by suicide. What, according to the documentary, did law enforcement believe could have been the motive for Nathan's mother's murder? You guessed it, money. Money. And of course, this would not be the first time. Money is so often a motivator in homicide, especially when you're talking about the large amount of money that this larger family estate had. What's so interesting about this documentary from a psychological perspective, his father in the documentary says he was diagnosed when he was very young, I think 4 or 5, with autism. Actually, in 2013, when there was a new edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders that was released, a disorder called Asperger's, which was somewhat related, was actually removed. And in the new edition, the name of the disorder was autism spectrum disorder, with the idea that there is a spectrum of symptoms and severity. There are mixed reports about the diagnosis of Nathan Carman. There are some reports that suggest that he was diagnosed with Asperger's. In the documentary, Nathan's father actually reports it as autism. And the mental disorder is especially important in this case because how Nathan presented, some of the symptoms that he presented, which were consistent with an autism spectrum diagnosis, were very noticeable. For example, in police interviews, they were very evident. One could see them on the surface. Examples of symptoms or behaviors like poor eye contact, showing little affect, having a very kind of rigid emotional expression. There was talk in the documentary about him being very focused on planning. A lot of the language that Nathan used, that one could see in police interviews, appeared very stilted, robotic, very formal. And law enforcement at the time looked at some of this behavior answers, the way he spoke about what happened to his mother and interpreted the way that he was acting, the way that he was reacting to the situation, the language he was using, the seriousness on his face as he spoke about it. He had a very like fixed, strong eye contact. Many people at the time interpreted this behavior as an indicator of guilt, that if a young son didn't actually kill his mother, they would not act this way. But the concern that I have in watching this documentary is that I really think the viewer may take from this that there is this strong association between autism spectrum and violence or homicide. And actually, the research is very clear. Autism alone is not significantly associated with violence or homicide. In fact, research actually shows that individuals with autism spectrum disorder are more at risk of being the victims of violence themselves. So I just want to make that point. I think it's really important. I imagine that a lot of individuals with autism spectrum disorder, I imagine that a lot of individuals with autism spectrum disorder may have a very negative, strong reaction to this documentary and to what seems to be the suggestion that homicide and autism are related, when again the research shows that is not true. And it does a real disservice to so many individuals who have an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis and are living their lives in pro social ways, in ways where they are decent human beings and will never have any intention and will never engage in violent behavior. So, I hope this reminder has been helpful as we think about autism as it's portrayed in the Carman family deaths. I'm Dr. Seth Meyers, psychologist.